The keys lay on the cracked pavement like a fallen constellation, a small, metallic glint against the grimy gray of the sidewalk. Leo saw them from half a block away, a spark of unnatural light in the familiar urban decay of his neighborhood. They were heavy in his small hand, heavier than any keys he had ever held. A thick, silver chain bound them to a formidable piece of metal. A skull, wrought from dark, polished steel, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through him. It wasn't a cheap plastic toy from a vending machine. It felt old, important, and dangerous. He clutched them, the cold metal a stark contrast to the humid afternoon air. His mother, Sarah, had sent him to Henderson's corner store for a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, the last of their grocery money tucked safely in the pocket of his worn jeans. The mission was simple, a straight line there and back. But the keys had created a detour, a moral crossroads on the cracked concrete. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, a constant, gentle refrain from a life of scarcity. Honesty is all we truly own, Leo. Don't ever sell it cheap. He knew what he had to do. He had seen the motorcycles earlier, a rumbling herd of chrome and black iron parked outside the crow's nest, the bar on the edge of town that respectable people hurried past. The keys had to belong to one of them. The thought of approaching the men who rode those machines sent a tremor of fear through his 10-year-old frame. But the thought of keeping them was worse. It felt like theft, a betrayal of the one principle his mother had drilled into him. He turned, his destination no longer the store, but the bar, when a shadow fell over him. "What you got there, runt?" The voice was a familiar sneer, dripping with the casual cruelty of a bored teenager. Kyle loomed over him, flanked by his two usual cronies, shadows that mimicked his slouch and his smug grin. Kyle was 14, but he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a king ruling a kingdom of cracked pavement and neglected lawns. He was bigger than Leo, broader, with a face that was already hardening into a permanent scowl. "It's nothing," Leo mumbled, his hand instinctively tightening around the keys, trying to conceal them. It was a futile gesture. Kyle's eyes, sharp and predatory, had already locked onto the silver gleam of the chain dangling from Leo's fist. "Nothing? Doesn't look like nothing." Kyle's hand shot out, grabbing Leo's wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers like a vice. "Show me." Leo resisted, a small, desperate act of defiance. He tried to pull his arm back, his sneakers scuffing against the gravelly sidewalk. From the porches of the rundown houses lining the street, curtains twitched. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face was a permanent knot of disapproval, peered through her blinds, her expression sour. Down the block, two men paused their conversation, watched for a moment, then turned away, dismissing it as just another neighborhood squabble, the kind that wasn't their problem. Their silence was a wall, enclosing Leo in his humiliation. Kyle twisted Leo's wrist, forcing his fingers open. The keys tumbled into Kyle's waiting palm. He held them up, the steel skull glinting in the sunlight. "Well, look at this," he jeered, his friends chuckling on cue. "Fancy. Where'd a little gutter rat like you get something like this?" He dangled them in front of Leo's face. "Did you steal it?" Leo's face burned with shame, not from the accusation, but from the powerlessness, the public degradation. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I found them. I was going to return them." Kyle laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Return them? To who?" "Your imaginary rich daddy." He shoved Leo hard in the chest. Leo stumbled backward, his worn sneakers losing their grip, and landed with a painful thud on the unforgiving concrete. The world tilted, the indifferent faces in the windows blurring into a watercolor of apathy. The keys, his brief charge of responsibility, were now a tool for his tormentor. Kyle pocketed them, the metallic weight a new trophy in his collection of petty cruelties. "They're mine now," he declared, the finality of his tone a hammer blow. He and his friends sauntered off, their laughter echoing down the street, leaving Leo alone on the ground, the price of his honesty a scraped palm and the stinging, bitter taste of injustice. He lay there for a moment, the world silent again, the curtains drawn, the onlookers having consumed their small portion of drama for the day. He was just a boy on the ground, a familiar sight, easily forgotten. The rough texture of the asphalt pressed into Leo's cheek, a gritty reminder of his place in the world. He pushed himself up slowly, his elbow smarting, a new tear blossoming on the knee of his already faded jeans. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't just the keys. It was the casual dismissal from everyone. He was invisible until he was a target, and then he was just entertainment. He looked toward Henderson's corner store, its windows dusty, the open sign looking tired and unconvincing. Mr. Henderson stood in the doorway, a dish rag in his hand, his face a mask of weary indifference. He had seen the whole thing. He met Leo's gaze for a brief second, his eyes holding no sympathy, only a faint annoyance. "Take your troubles somewhere else, kid," he called out, his voice flat and devoid of concern. He wasn't a bad man, not really, just worn down by a lifetime of seeing things he couldn't or wouldn't fix. To him, Leo was part of the neighborhood's static, the background noise of poverty and petty strife. The denial of his worth was absolute. It came not just from Kyle's fists, but from Mr. Henderson's averted eyes and the snapped-shut blinds of his neighbors. Leo got to his feet, brushing the gravel from his palms. The money for the bread and milk was still in his pocket, a small, crumpled wad of paper that felt useless now. The immediate mission was forgotten, eclipsed by a larger, more pressing need. He had to get the keys back. It wasn't about their monetary value. It was about the principle. They weren't his, but they weren't Kyle's either. They belonged to someone, and in Leo's simple black-and-white world, that was the only thing that mattered. He started walking, not home, but in the direction Kyle and his friends had gone. He knew their usual haunts: the abandoned lot behind the old textile mill, the rusty bleachers of the high school baseball field. His fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a stubborn resolve he didn't know he possessed. He saw them near the underpass, huddled together, admiring their prize. Kyle was tossing the keys in the air and catching them, the skull keychain flashing with each rotation. "This thing's gotta be real silver," one of his friends, a lanky boy named Mark, said with awe. "We could probably get $50 for it." "Forget 50, Kyle scoffed, catching the keys with a flourish. "This is a collector's item. Some kind of gang thing, maybe. See this skull? It's badass. I'm keeping it." Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew confronting them again was foolish, a guaranteed path to more pain. But the image of his mother's tired but proud face flashed in his mind. She worked a double shift as a waitress at the diner and cleaned offices at night, her hands perpetually smelling of bleach and coffee. She never complained. She just did what had to be done. And she expected the same of him, not in labor, but in character. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of exhaust fumes from the nearby highway, and stepped out from behind the concrete pillar he'd been using for cover. "Give them back, Kyle." His voice was stronger this time, surprising even himself. It held a tremor, but it didn't break. The three teenagers turned, their expressions shifting from smug satisfaction to irritated surprise. Kyle rolled his eyes. "You again? Don't you ever learn?" "They're not yours," Leo said, standing his ground, his small fists clenched at his sides. "I have to return them." Kyle let out a short, incredulous laugh. He took a step toward Leo, his posture radiating menace. "You have to? Who's gonna make me give them back?" "You." He gestured around at the empty, desolate space under the bridge. "There's no one here to help you, runt." He was right. The world had shrunk to this small circle of concrete and steel, a forgotten space where the rules of civilization felt thin and fragile. The tension crackled in the air. Kyle wasn't just a bully now. He was a gatekeeper, a force of nature denying Leo's right to exist with dignity. Every person who had looked away had empowered him, had validated his belief that he could do whatever he wanted to a boy like Leo without consequence. This conflict was no longer just about a set of keys. It was about whether a boy's quiet integrity had any value in a world that only seemed to respect brute force. Kyle took another step, closing the distance between them, his shadow swallowing Leo whole. "I'm going to teach you a lesson about minding your own business," he snarled, his hand balling into a fist. The world Leo knew was a small apartment that always smelled faintly of lavender air freshener and his mother's rose-scented hand soap. It was a world of second-hand furniture and patched-up clothes, but it was a world built on a foundation of unshakable integrity. His mother, Sarah, was the architect of that world. He remembered her sitting at their small kitchen table late at night, a stack of bills on one side and a cup of lukewarm tea on the other, her face etched with exhaustion. But when she looked at him, her weariness would melt away, replaced by a fierce, protective love. "We don't lie, we don't cheat, and we don't take what isn't ours," she would tell him, her voice soft but firm. "Our name, Leo, that's our inheritance. It's the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away." His father had been a soldier, a man Leo only knew from a single, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. In the photo, he was young, smiling, his uniform crisp. He had died in a place Leo couldn't pronounce when Leo was just a baby. He'd left behind a purple heart, a folded flag, and a small, smooth stone he'd carried in his pocket for good luck. Sarah had given the stone to Leo. "Your father believed in doing the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing," she'd explained, closing Leo's small fingers around it. "He said courage wasn't about not being scared. It was about being scared and doing it anyway." Leo kept the stone in a little box in his drawer. Sometimes, when he felt small or afraid, he would hold it, its coolness a tangible link to a man he'd never known but whose principles were the bedrock of his existence. These lessons were not abstract concepts to Leo. They were survival tools. They were the armor he wore against the world's casual cruelties. When kids at school mocked his worn-out shoes, he remembered his mother's words about their good name and held his head a little higher. When he was lonely, he would think of the smiling man in the photograph and the smooth stone in his drawer, and he would feel a little less alone. Now, standing under the grimy underpass, facing Kyle's snarling face, these memories were not just comforting. They were a command. Returning the keys was not a choice. It was a duty. It was a tribute to his mother's sacrifices and his father's memory. Giving up, letting Kyle win, would be like telling them that their lessons, their entire philosophy for a dignified life, were meaningless. It would be giving away his inheritance. The keys in Kyle's pocket were more than just metal. They were a test. And as Kyle's shadow fell over him, Leo felt the familiar weight of his father's stone in his mind, its coolness spreading through him, chasing away the heat of his fear. He thought of his mother coming home from her second job, her shoulders slumped, and how her face would light up when he showed her on a spelling test. That simple joy was what he was fighting for. It was the joy of being good, of being decent, in a world that often rewarded the opposite. He wasn't fighting for a reward or for recognition. He was fighting for the quiet, internal satisfaction of knowing he was his mother's son and his father's legacy. This quiet strength, forged in a small, love-filled apartment amidst a world of hardship, was his only weapon. It was invisible to Kyle, who only saw a small, scared kid in shabby clothes. Kyle couldn't see the generations of honor, the nightly lessons in integrity, the weight of a soldier's courage. He couldn't see that he wasn't just pushing a boy. He was pushing against a mountain of principle. And that was a fight he was destined to lose, even if he won the physical battle. Leo's resolve hardened. He met Kyle's glare, his own eyes clear and unwavering. He would not back down. He would not give his inheritance away. The pressure under the bridge became a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket of dread. Kyle, enraged by Leo's quiet defiance, shoved him again, harder this time. Leo stumbled back, his heel catching on a loose piece of concrete, but he didn't fall. He caught his balance, his body braced, his gaze still locked on Kyle. "I told you to give them back," Leo repeated, his voice tight. The sheer stubbornness of the smaller boy seemed to short-circuit Kyle's brain. He was used to victims who cowered, who cried, who ran. He wasn't prepared for one who simply stood there, absorbing the punishment and refusing to break. "You've got a death wish, runt?" Kyle spat, his face turning a blotchy red. He looked at his friends, Mark and a shorter, stockier boy named Dave, for support. They looked uneasy. This was escalating beyond their usual brand of petty torment. "Just leave it, Kyle," Mark mumbled, glancing nervously toward the mouth of the underpass. "He's not worth it." "He is when he doesn't do what he's told," Kyle snapped back, his authority challenged. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his audience. His ego was as fragile as it was large. He turned back to Leo, his eyes narrowing. "Last chance. Get lost, or I'll make you wish you'd never been born." The air grew thick and still. The distant hum of traffic on the highway above was the only sound. Leo could feel his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear. But beneath the fear, the image of his father's photograph and his mother's tired smile held firm. He was a statue of resolve. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. His silence was his final, most powerful act of defiance. It infuriated Kyle more than any insult could have. With a roar of frustration, Kyle lunged. He didn't just shove this time. He swung a clumsy, open-handed slap that caught Leo across the cheek. The sound echoed in the enclosed space. The sting was sharp, electric, bringing tears to Leo's eyes. But he didn't cry out. He absorbed the blow, a small gasp escaping his lips, and a red handprint began to bloom on his pale skin. Dave, the other friend, finally spoke up. "Hey man, that's enough. Let's just go." The sight of the red mark on Leo's face had crossed a line for him. This wasn't fun anymore. But Kyle was lost in his own rage. "Shut up, both of you," he yelled, his voice cracking. He grabbed the front of Leo's thin t-shirt, bunching the fabric in his fist. He pulled Leo close, their faces inches apart. "You think you're tough?" he hissed, his breath hot and sour. Leo could see the insecurity flickering in Kyle's eyes, the desperate need to prove himself. In that moment, Leo wasn't afraid of him. He pitied him. The bystanders, the silent community, were absent here. There were no twitching curtains or averted gazes. Under the bridge, they were utterly alone, in a pocket of the world forgotten by everyone else. The pressure had reached its peak. Leo was enduring, holding onto his principles in the face of raw, physical aggression. He had no one to save him. He knew that whatever happened next, he would have to face it alone. His body was trembling, the adrenaline and fear warring with the steadfast courage his parents had instilled in him. He had been judged, dismissed, and now he was being broken. But as Kyle raised his fist again, Leo knew one thing for certain. They could hurt his body, but they couldn't touch his spirit. He had already made his choice. In the split second before Kyle's fist could land, Leo reacted. It wasn't a calculated move, but a pure, instinctual flight or fight response, filtered through his singular mission. He didn't fight. He twisted his body, wrenching himself free from Kyle's grasp with surprising force. The worn fabric of his t-shirt ripped with a sharp, tearing sound. But he was free. And then he ran. He didn't run home. He didn't run towards the relative safety of the populated streets. He ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the industrial edge of town, towards the one place that frightened him almost as much as Kyle did. The crow's nest. His small legs pumped, his lungs burning, each stride a desperate push away from the bullies and a determined step towards his duty. He could hear Kyle and his friends shouting behind him, their footsteps pounding on the pavement as they gave chase. "Get back here, you little freak!" Kyle's voice was a furious roar, carried on the wind. Leo didn't look back. His focus was narrowed to a single point. The peeling black paint of the bar's sign, now visible a few hundred yards away. The motorcycles were still there, a line of sleeping iron beasts gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Chrome pipes, leather seats, and imposing frames. They were magnificent and terrifying. The men who owned them had to be the same. He was running from one kind of danger directly into the maw of another. But in his mind, the two were vastly different. Kyle was chaos and cruelty for its own sake. The bikers, as intimidating as they were, represented a kind of order. Their bikes were meticulously cared for. Their presence had a purpose. The keys in Kyle's pocket belonged to that order, and Leo felt an undeniable pull to restore them to their rightful place. This was his selfless act. He wasn't thinking of a reward. He wasn't thinking of praise. He was actively running toward a potential confrontation with a group of notoriously fearsome men, all to return something that wasn't his. He was risking his own safety not for personal gain, but for a principle. He could feel the gap between him and his pursuers closing. His side was starting to stitch, a sharp, stabbing pain with every breath. He pushed harder, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. He could see the entrance to the bar now, a dark, unwelcoming doorway. What would he say? What would he do? Would they even listen to a 10-year-old boy with a ripped shirt and a red mark on his face? Would they believe him? The questions swirled, but they didn't slow him down. His mother's words about doing the right thing, especially when it's hard, were the fuel for his final sprint. He was a small, desperate comet streaking through the forgotten part of town, his trajectory aimed squarely at the heart of the unknown. Behind him, Kyle was faster. He was closing the distance, his breath coming in ragged gasps of fury. "You're dead, Leo," he screamed. Leo could feel the vibrations of his footsteps through the soles of his sneakers. He was just yards from the bar's entrance now, so close he could smell the faint, stale scent of beer and cigarette smoke wafting from the open door. He braced himself, ready for Kyle's hand to grab his shoulder, to be yanked back into the nightmare. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw Kyle's face, contorted with rage, his arm outstretched, fingers just inches away. This was it. He had failed. He had run as fast as he could, and it wasn't enough. He closed his eyes, expecting the impact. From the quiet street corners and the windows of passing cars, the narrative began to change. Mrs. Gable, who had initially dismissed the confrontation with a disapproving click of her tongue, had kept watching. She saw Kyle pocket the keys. She saw him and his friends corner Leo again under the bridge from a distance. And now, she saw the small boy running, not cowering, but with a look of frantic purpose on his face. He wasn't running home to his mother. He was running toward the one place in the neighborhood everyone else avoided. Her brow, usually furrowed in judgment, softened with a flicker of confusion, then something akin to dawning respect. "Good heavens," she murmured to her cat, who was sunning itself on the windowsill. "The boy's not running away. He's running at his store." Mr. Henderson was sweeping the sidewalk, his movements slow and methodical. He saw the chase flash past his storefront, a small, determined blur followed by a trio of angry teenagers. He too noted Leo's trajectory. The kid wasn't heading for the residential blocks. He was heading for the industrial zone, for the biker bar. Mr. Henderson stopped sweeping. He leaned on his broom, his cynical gaze sharpening with a new curiosity. He had seen Leo's type before, quiet, poor, easy targets. He had written him off. But this was different. This wasn't the behavior of a typical victim. There was a strange, defiant courage in the boy's flight. He was choosing to face a bigger, more legendary danger to escape a smaller, more immediate one. A flicker of something long dormant stirred in Mr. Henderson's chest. A grudging admiration. "What in the world is that boy up to?" he said to no one in particular. Whispers followed Leo's path like a ripple in a pond. Two teenagers loitering near the bus stop saw the chase. "Dude, isn't that Kyle?" one said. "What's he chasing that little kid for?" "I don't know, but the kid's heading for the crow's nest," the other replied, his eyes wide. "He's got a death wish." The statement hung in the air, but the tone wasn't mocking. It was laced with a hint of awe. The community, which had been a silent, passive audience to Leo's humiliation, was now becoming an active observer of his inexplicable courage. Their assumptions were being dismantled with every stride Leo took. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't just a victim. He was something else, something they hadn't bothered to see before. They were rethinking the easy labels they had applied to the quiet boy with the worn-out shoes. The shame that began as a small prickle in some of them started to grow. They had watched him be bullied and done nothing. They had judged him for his poverty and his silence. Now they were witnessing that same boy perform an act of insane, incomprehensible bravery, and their inaction felt heavy, shameful. The perception of Leo was shifting from a problem to be ignored to a puzzle to be solved. His desperate sprint was rewriting his story in their minds, transforming him from a footnote in the neighborhood's daily life into the protagonist of an unfolding drama. They were no longer just onlookers. They were witnesses, and as Leo neared the biker bar, a collective, unspoken question hung in the air across the neighborhood. What could possibly be so important that a small boy would willingly run into the lion's den? Just as Kyle's fingers were about to close around the torn collar of Leo's shirt, the heavy wooden door of the crow's nest swung inward with a deep groan. The sudden movement was so unexpected that it made Kyle flinch, his lunge faltering for a crucial second. The dim, smoky interior of the bar was momentarily silhouetted by the figures emerging from it. They didn't rush out. They moved with a slow, deliberate weight, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the entire street. It was like the air had suddenly become thicker, charged with a low-frequency hum of power. First came two men, broad-shouldered and bearded, their leather vests adorned with patches that told stories of miles and allegiances. They were followed by more, a wall of denim and leather, their faces hard-bitten, their eyes missing nothing. They fanned out in a loose semicircle, their boots planting on the asphalt with an unnerving solidity. They were a brotherhood, moving as one organism, their collective presence a silent, overwhelming force. At the center of them, stepping out last, was a man who seemed to be the source of their gravity. He was older than the others, his dark beard shot through with streaks of gray, his hair pulled back in a tight, short ponytail. He wasn't the tallest, but he was built like a mountain, solid and immovable. A deep, jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving his already intense gaze an even more formidable quality. On his vest, over his heart, was a single patch that read President. This was Stone. His eyes, the color of worn slate, scanned the scene with an unnerving calm. They took in the three teenagers, frozen in their tracks, and the small, terrified boy just out of their reach. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The low, guttural rumble of a dozen motorcycle engines suddenly turning over, one after another, spoke for him. The sound was deafening, a mechanical roar that vibrated through the ground, through the soles of their shoes, and into their bones. It was a declaration, a warning. Kyle and his friends were paralyzed. The swagger and cruelty had evaporated from them, replaced by a stark, primal fear. Their world of petty dominance had just collided with a world of genuine, lethal authority. They looked like what they were: scared children who had stumbled into a cage with a pack of wolves. Stone's gaze drifted from the bullies to Leo. He saw the boy's ripped shirt, the red handprint on his cheek, the tear tracks on his dusty face. He saw the fear, but he also saw the stubborn set of his jaw, the refusal to completely break. The roar of the engines subsided to a menacing, synchronized idle. The silence that followed was more intimidating than the noise. The bikers stood like statues, a silent jury, their eyes fixed on the scene. They were waiting for their president to pass judgment. The street, which moments before had been the stage for a boy's desperate flight, had now become a courtroom. And court was in session. The arrival was not an accident of timing. One of the bikers, a man with a handlebar mustache named Grizz, had been by the window, about to step out for a smoke. He had seen the whole chase, the big kids hunting the little one. He had simply turned and said two words to the room: Prez. Trouble now. The Brotherhood stood as a silent, imposing phalanx, a physical manifestation of a code that outsiders couldn't comprehend. They were protectors, enforcers, and on this street, at this moment, they were the highest law in the land. Leo's breath hitched in his throat, but the terror he felt from Kyle was instantly replaced by a different, more profound kind of awe. He was surrounded by giants, by the very men he had been so afraid to approach. Yet, strangely, he felt a sliver of safety in their formidable presence. He took a shaky step forward, away from Kyle and toward the mountain of a man with the president patch. All eyes were on him. He could feel the collective gaze of the bikers, heavy and analytical. He reached into his own pocket, his fingers fumbling with the crumpled grocery money, and realized his mistake. The keys were gone. His heart sank. Kyle still had them. His entire desperate run had been for nothing. Tears of frustration welled in his eyes, blurring the intimidating figures in front of him. But then he saw it. As Kyle had frozen, his hand had gone slack, and the heavy keys had slipped from his grasp. They lay on the ground midway between him and Leo, the steel skull seeming to glare up at the sky. Without thinking, Leo darted forward, snatched the keys from the pavement, and turned back to Stone. He walked the final few feet, his legs trembling, and stopped directly in front of the biker president. He held out his hand, the keys resting on his small, grimy palm. "I think these are yours, sir," he said, his voice small but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. Stone's gaze dropped from Leo's face to the keys. His expression, which had been a mask of stone, flickered with something unreadable. He recognized them instantly. The skull fob was a one-of-a-kind piece, forged from a piece of shrapnel that had nearly killed his best friend, a fallen brother years ago. The keys opened everything. His custom-built panhead, his house, a locker at the clubhouse that held the charter and other sacred club documents. They were irreplaceable. He looked back at Leo, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw the honesty in the boy's wide, tear-filled eyes, the lack of guile. This wasn't a transaction. The boy expected nothing. Grizz, the biker who had seen the chase from the window, stepped forward and pointed a thick finger at Kyle. "That one," he growled, his voice a low rumble. He and his buddies were chasing the kid down. Looked like they were trying to take something from him. Stone's gaze shifted to Kyle, and the temperature on the street dropped another 10 degrees. Kyle visibly shrank, his face pale. He stole them," Kyle stammered, his voice cracking, a last, pathetic attempt to save himself. Stone's eyes narrowed. He looked at the keys in Leo's hand, then at the fresh, red handprint on Leo's cheek, then at the ripped shirt. He looked at the terror on Kyle's face and the defiant dignity on Leo's. The truth was written all over the scene, plain as day. He didn't need a confession. He had the evidence. "This boy," Stone said, his voice dangerously quiet, "ran through hell to bring me my property, which you took from him. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict." He reached out, his hand, calloused and huge, gently closing over Leo's. He didn't take the keys. Instead, he curled Leo's own fingers around them, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You hold on to these for a minute, son," he said softly. Then he straightened up, his full attention falling on Kyle and his two terrified friends. The reveal was complete. It wasn't Leo who had to explain himself. His actions had spoken for him. The bikers, men who lived by a strict, often brutal code of honor and respect, understood immediately what had happened. They had witnessed a profound act of integrity from the most unlikely of sources. And in their world, honor, especially when displayed with courage, demanded to be recognized. The truth had been brought to light, not by words, but by the silent evidence of a boy's character. The recognition came not with a roar, but with a quiet, profound gesture. Stone kept his massive hand on Leo's shoulder, a silent statement of protection and ownership. "Kid," he said, his voice rumbling with a respect that was more valuable than any currency. "You've got more guts and more honor than most grown men I know." He then turned his gaze, cold and hard as flint, back to Kyle. He didn't need to raise his voice. His quiet intensity was far more terrifying. "You put your hands on this boy again," he said, his voice a low, lethal promise, "and you'll have to answer to me, to all of us. Do you understand?" Kyle, his face ashen, could only manage a series of frantic, jerky nods, his eyes wide with a terror he would likely never forget. "Now get out of my sight," Stone commanded. The three teenagers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled away, stumbling over their own feet, their flight pathetic and desperate. They disappeared around the corner, their brief reign of terror brought to an ignominious end. The street fell silent again, the only sound the rhythmic idle of the motorcycles. Stone then knelt, bringing himself down to Leo's eye level. The sheer size of him, even on one knee, was intimidating, but his eyes held a newfound warmth. "What's your name, son?" "Leo," the boy whispered. "Leo," Stone repeated, nodding slowly. "Well, Leo, what you did today, that takes character." He gently took the keys from Leo's hand. He looked at the boy's ripped shirt and the scuffs on his knees. "Looks like you had a rough day on our account." He stood up and turned to one of his brothers, a biker known as Wrench. "Go to the sporting goods store. Get the kid the best bike they've got. Top of the line." And a helmet. Wrench nodded once and peeled off, heading for his bike. But Stone wasn't finished. The material reward was secondary. The true recognition was about to be bestowed. He unzipped his own leather vest, the hallowed cute that was the symbol of his life, his identity. From the inside pocket he pulled a small, folded object. It was a patch, one that wasn't part of the official club insignia. It was simpler. A single, silver wing with the word honor stitched beneath it in black thread. It was a personal token, one he gave only to those who had earned his deepest respect, a group so small you could count them on one hand. He held it out to Leo. "This is for you," he said. "It means you're a friend of the club. It means you're under our protection. Anyone ever gives you trouble, you just show them this." Leo stared at the patch, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the gesture. He had just wanted to return some keys. He had ended up with a king's favor. While this was happening, 2 other bikers had already received unspoken orders. They mounted their bikes and roared off in the direction of Henderson's corner store. They walked in, their presence sucking all the air out of the small, cramped space. Mr. Henderson froze behind his counter, his heart hammering. They didn't say a word about the incident. They simply walked to the bread aisle, took a loaf, went to the cooler for a carton of milk, and then proceeded to fill 2 large shopping baskets with everything a growing boy might need. Cereal, juice, fresh fruit, canned goods, pasta. They piled it all on the counter. One of them pulled out a thick roll of cash and peeled off several $100 bills, dropping them on the counter. "This is for the boy, Leo," one of them growled. "And his mother. You make sure they get it. And from now on, you treat him with respect. You understand?" Mr. Henderson, his face pale, could only nod. The message was clear. The boy he had dismissed was now untouchable, a ward of the most powerful and feared group in the city. The bikers left as quickly as they came, leaving a stunned store owner and a counter full of groceries paid for 10 times over. The community was watching this too. Mrs. Gable saw the bikers head to the store. She saw Wrench return a short while later with a gleaming new bicycle, its paint sparkling in the sun. She saw Stone, the formidable president, talking to Leo not as a child, but as an equal. The symbolic respect was public, undeniable, and it was transforming Leo's world before his very eyes. The sun began its slow descent, painting the industrial sky in hues of orange and purple. The roaring engines of the Hells Angels had faded into the distance, but their presence lingered, a protective echo in the quiet streets. Leo sat on his new bicycle, his hands gripping the handlebars, his knuckles white. It was a magnificent machine, a stark contrast to the worn-out second-hand world he was used to. It was black and chrome, solid and real, a tangible symbol of the day's impossible events. In the basket, Wrench had placed a bag containing a new helmet, a heavy-duty lock, and the small, embroidered patch that felt heavier than anything Leo had ever held. He hadn't ridden it home yet. He had simply walked it, pushing it slowly through the neighborhood, the world looking different from beside its gleaming frame. The change was palpable. As he passed the row of houses where curtains had twitched in judgment just hours before, the same curtains were now pulled back to reveal faces of awe and respect. People on their porches, who once would have looked through him, now met his gaze and nodded. It was a small gesture, a simple dip of the chin, but it was a currency he had never been paid before. It was respect. He saw Mrs. Gable on her porch, not scowling, but holding a watering can, a small, tentative smile on her face. As he passed, she lifted her hand in a gentle, deliberate wave. Leo, surprised, waved back. Her smile widened. It was the first time she had ever truly seen him. When he reached Henderson's corner store, Mr. Henderson was waiting outside. He hurried over, his face a mixture of anxiety and newfound deference. "Leo," he said, his voice strained. Your friends were here. They bought you some things." He pointed to several large boxes packed with the groceries the bikers had purchased. "I can help you carry them home." "It's okay, Mr. Henderson," Leo said quietly, his voice steady. "My mom will be home soon. We can get them then," but Mr. Henderson insisted, his eagerness to please a stark reversal of his earlier indifference. He loaded one of the boxes onto his own dolly and walked with Leo the rest of the way home, making awkward, respectful conversation. He was no longer speaking to the neighborhood runt. He was speaking to a boy who had the personal protection of the Hells Angels. The world had tilted on its axis. Leo arrived home to find his mother, Sarah, just getting back from her first shift, her face etched with a familiar weariness. It melted away into stunned confusion as she saw her son with a brand-new bicycle and the local store owner delivering boxes of groceries like a personal concierge. Leo told her the whole story, his voice quiet and factual. He told her about the keys, about Kyle, about running to the bar, and about the man named Stone. He showed her the patch. Sarah listened, her hand over her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. They weren't tears of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming pride. He had been tested, and he had not faltered. He had upheld the one thing she had taught him to value above all else. That night, as the last light faded from the sky, Leo stood on his small balcony, looking out over the neighborhood. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer a target. He had a place. He had earned his belonging not by being loud or aggressive, but by being quiet and true. In the distance, a low, familiar rumble echoed through the city. It wasn't a single bike. It was a pack. The sound of motorcycles roaring to life, a sound that once would have made him flinch. But now it sounded different. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was the sound of a brotherhood watching over its own. The sound of earned respect. The final image lingered in the twilight. A small boy, standing tall, the cool night air on his face, secure in the knowledge that he was no longer alone. His quiet dignity having called forth the most unlikely and powerful of guardians.